In the 20th century, there were few events as massive, as sudden, or as tragic as the 1947 partition of India. It was a moment that didn't just redraw a map, it displaced millions of people and carved scars that are still felt today. So, in this explainer, we're going to dive in and try to understand what led to this incredible fracture. Okay, so before all the division, there was this powerful idea, this dream of a unified subcontinent. And this famous poem by Muhammad Iqbal, it just captures that spirit perfectly. A shared homeland, a garden of delights. What's really ironic, though, is that Iqbal himself would later become a major voice for creating a separate state for India's Muslims. That contradiction alone tells you just how complicated things were getting under the surface.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How did a land that was celebrated in poetry for its beautiful unity completely unravel into violence and division? The answer, well, it's not simple, and it starts way before 1947.
To really get the fracture, we've got to go back. It's kind of easy to look back now and think that Hindus and Muslims were always on a collision course, but that just wasn't the case. For centuries, the subcontinent had a totally different story, a much more complex story of coexistence.
You know, what's so fascinating is how different the social and political world was back then. Pre-colonial empires like the Mughals weren't these rigid, centralized states we think of today. Nope, they were built on flexible allegiances. You saw this incredible cultural mixing in art, in music, in language. You had Sufi mystics who were helping Islam find its place in the Indian environment, and rulers of different faiths were making powerful alliances. I mean, get this. Even under the Emperor Aurangzeb, who's often seen as a hardliner, nearly a quarter of his top officials were actually Hindus.
But then, everything started to change when the British arrived. Their way of doing things, their administration, it didn't just conquer the subcontinent. It completely reorganized its society from the ground up.
And here it is. This is the crucial shift. To rule a place this huge and complex, the British felt they needed to simplify it. And how did they do that? Through massive surveys and a census that sorted every single person into these neat, fixed boxes of religion and caste. Identities that had been a lot more fluid before were now written down, counted, and hardened. They became the main way you got political power.
And this brings us to a really interesting debate among historians. Is the story of partition all about the big leaders, Nehru, Jinnah, making decisions at the top? Or is it a story that comes from the bottom up? The subaltern view focuses more on ordinary people. It argues that these new colonial categories became really powerful tools for communities to rally together and reinvent their own identities for political goals. And that shift, well, it would have massive consequences.
So with all that as background, let's get to the crisis itself. To really, truly understand what happened in 1947, it helps to stop thinking of it as just one single event.
The historian Gyanendra Pandey has this brilliant framework. He suggests we should think about partition as three separate but connected tragedies. You have the political partition, the provincial partition, and then the human partition. Let's break each one down. Okay, first, you've got the political partition. This is the high-level stuff, the decisions made in boardrooms by the political elites. After years of talks going nowhere and tensions just getting worse and worse, the British, who were in a huge hurry to leave, finally just accepted the plan to split the subcontinent into two new nations, India and Pakistan. This was the clean, official act signed and sealed. But that neat political line on a map had absolutely brutal, messy consequences on the ground. Drawing a border straight through the provinces of Punjab and Bengal, these were regions where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived together for centuries. It was like taking a butcher's knife to a living body. It set off a firestorm of violence, especially in Punjab, starting as early as March 1947, months before independence was even declared. And that brings us to the third and, honestly, the most tragic partition of all, the human one. This wasn't about borders on a map anymore. This was about the fabric of society just tearing apart. It was friendships of a lifetime severed in an instant, families forced to abandon homes their ancestors had built. It was the complete collapse of a shared world. The scale of the violence, it's just staggering. The conservative estimates say that over 500,000 people were killed in the chaos. Millions more were uprooted in one of the biggest and fastest migrations in all of human history. But a number that big, it's so large it almost becomes abstract, you know? It's impossible to really comprehend.
This is the horrific reality hiding behind that number. When you read the testimony of survivors, like this from Setnam Kaur, it reveals these unspeakable acts of violence, often committed by people who were, just a few weeks earlier, their neighbors. This was the human partition, a trauma that is just seared into the memory of millions. So, in the wake of this absolute catastrophe, two new nations, India and Pakistan, set off on their own independent journeys. But they were starting from completely different places. On one hand, you had India. It basically inherited the entire machinery of the British Raj, the civil service, the army, the industrial centers, all of it controlled by the very experienced Congress Party. Pakistan, on the other hand, had to build a central government from literally nothing. It was a country split in two, separated by 1,000 miles of India, with a mostly agricultural economy. And right from the beginning, its politics were dominated by the military and bureaucracy, not by established political parties. These starting points set them on completely different trajectories.
Of course, the story doesn't just end in 1947. Not even close. The partition created these deep fault lines that have been causing tremors across the subcontinent ever since. I mean, you can trace this legacy through decades of conflict. The first war over Kashmir started almost immediately. Then, in 1971, the strains on Pakistan became too much, leading to a brutal civil war and the creation of Bangladesh. The rivalry eventually went nuclear, with both countries testing weapons in 1998. The fracture of 1947 has never really healed. And really, if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that partition is not some dusty chapter in a history book. It is a living, breathing force. It shapes elections today, it defines national identities, it fuels conflicts, and it lives on in the personal stories of families on every side of those borders.
And that leaves us with a pretty powerful final thought. These modern, rigid nation-states that came out of 1947 are, in a lot of ways, a colonial inheritance. But as we saw at the beginning, the subcontinent's own much longer history offers different models of flexible boundaries, of cultural mixing, of shared lives. It makes you wonder, right? Does the fracture of 1947 really have to define the subcontinent forever?